The real motivation for me as I looked around the museum and tried to decide where I wanted to take a group of people was that I grew up in Seattle, and I kind of wanted to think about and talk about Seattle. And Mark Tobey was in Seattle when he made this painting. He'd been there for about 6 years in that particular part of his life and stayed there for quite a bit longer. The starting place for me, though, is that I really love paintings. Here's a museum full of many different things we could be spending time on, and I wanted to be with two paintings. I think I love paintings specifically because they have a border. They actually end. There's a lot of artwork, particularly contemporary artwork, that seems to never end. A painting has a physical boundary. I like the sort of formality of its plane and of the history of working in a two-dimensional space. When I look at this painting, part of what I look into is Tobey's chance to do his work in the midst of this milieu that interests me because I'm interested in the history of Seattle. I know a little bit about Tobey's approach to what was called white writing, which was a name given to this particular approach to composition given by a New York art critic and not by Tobey. So in 1944, a few years, about 6 years into Tobey's being back in Seattle, he was offered a show, his first solo show in New York at the Willard Gallery. A gallerist named Marion Willard, and had been convinced partly by Lionel Feininger, a painter in New York who was a close and very appreciative colleague of Tobey's, to grant the show. And it was filled almost exclusively with this approach, which got termed white writing. Every part of this composition is being addressed. The edge is not entirely distinct from the center, though in this example, obviously, you have this sort of vortex coming in. Other examples in the show at the Willard Gallery had a much more dispersed field of composition. These aspects of his practice were really quite new and did not fall on deaf ears at all. They fell into conversations that included figures like Jackson Pollock, who went to see that show and commented on the strength of the work. This piece, actually, having been shown in the New York show, became part of Tobey's first full museum show here at the Portland Art Museum in 1945. By the summer of 1945, the Portland Art Museum, together with the San Francisco Museum of Art, had put together a show of 31 paintings. Every one of the 31 was tempera on board, all of them, most of them quite small in size, and all of them in this technique. Interesting to see Tobey, who was working, as I understand it, largely either on an easel or on a vertical surface and dealing with a brush, and it was the brush and its touch onto the surface which is where he was really conducting his action. But his actions in the white writing paintings went into that compositional approach that was addressing every part of the surface. You've got a dark board on which he's painted that whole field in that color, and then the painting in the white, and then some of the dark marks come over that, and so that the red that's coming through is actually a back layer. They're supposed to give a kind of quick movement. Tobey describes them as capturing the mesh of the net of living that men are caught in. He also has described them as a net of light, and often speaks of them as capturing not so much the space as the dynamic movement of figures through space. Interestingly, figures actually disappear from a lot of the work that he is describing in this way. He's naming the other painting this time, in addition to Broadway Norm, there was a follow-up called Broadway. There were several paintings with New York in the title, one the San Francisco Street. He's being very specific about where these places were, even though they weren't depicting a kind of figurative realism in any way. So I see him thinking some about what it means to be positioned in a place geographically and what identities stem from that. And I I don't think of that as an issue he had an easy resolution to. If we come then to 60 years later, and Whiting Tennis, a Seattle painter, faced with an opportunity that came to him thanks to the Portland Art Museum. He's a painter who had been working at a much smaller scale, and when he got nominated for the Contemporary Art Award, the 2008 Arlene Schnitzer Award, he came down and saw the size of wall that Pam was going to offer him and decided, I'm going to make a painting that's going to fit on that wall. Never had done that size of composition before. But it's interesting, you get to that point 60 years later, and I find one of the pleasures of this painting to be its complete lack of concern or pressure or anxiety about the question of a center. Pam's inclusion of Whiting Tennis was the occasion on which he decided he could make a painting of this scale. Having decided to make a painting of this scale, he knew that his subject needed to be a house he'd been walking past with his dog. His studio is in a nondescript, sprawly part of Seattle near Bitter Lake, which is in the sort of north middle of the city. And he walks with his dog every day, and they'd walk past this thing, this what he calls a compound. We're obviously dealing with a very different compositional method, and for me, this is a maybe paradoxical example of all-over painting. There isn't in this one that kind of single line of horizon line of perspective. At any point, you can regard the subject and move up or down and not feel as though you're, sort of lifting off the ground or coming down close to it. One of the things that drew me to pairing the Tobey with the Whiting Tennis is how important the museum has been in the sort of making public of the painting. That act I spoke about right at the start of how important it is to regard the painter and say to them, we are taking that from you. Good work, time to give it up and give it into public space where we are all going to use it and we're all going to think through it. A lot of painters work on incredibly important work and do not get that message and have the thing drawn out into public. The whole thing on canvas is entirely a field of paper, paper which he cuts out in 12 by 11 inch blocks or pieces. He used to use newsprint always. He says he loves newsprint, but he got convinced he better use acid-free paper so that people who buy the paintings don't feel gypped. He's somebody who worked in construction for a long time and then worked doing set design and set construction for a theater in Seattle. And then when he speaks about the creation of the painting, Whiting talks about creating the set, and then layer by layer he makes the set until he has what he calls a credible space onto which he can then move these figures. He'll paint on the carved plywood, lay the paper over and sort of lightly touch it with his hands, pull it off, it'll be a single color. Then he'll paint again in a slightly different shade, lay the thing back on a little bit skewed, and pull it off again. And so one result, for instance, is the grass. The grass is one set of blocks with generally just two colors. And as he put it, he says, if you put one color down, it's completely transparently one color. If you do two colors, it looks like six colors. And by doing the two just slightly skewed off, he manages to get this kind of complexity of color. What he's created is a process that allows him to be a painter while he's actually being a builder. And it seems to me this is a way to be a painter and not to be dealing with the brush and dealing with this thing, but dealing instead with a process much like construction.